Good morning, everybody. It is Sunday, April 3rd, and I thought I might start the day just by going over a couple things that have caught my eye as I was kind of scanning the news this morning. And I have some stories up, not necessarily from, the sources that I think are the greatest sources in the world, but I'm just kind of using, main media outlets like Reuters and the New York Times. I'm just sort of using these articles as bullet points along the way as I discuss the topics. So I definitely encourage everybody to go ahead and, do some research and try to find some other articles on topics that I discuss. But these are all evolving issues anyway, so we're sort of just going to touch on them, and I'm sure that you and I will both be thinking about them again as the days and weeks progress. So if I go to Google News here, I mean, the story is at the top, of course, the election, and after that, a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily find too concerning. Obviously, nuclear security summit meeting might be pretty important, but I thought I might just kind of go into some topics that I found individually interesting. So lately with Donald Trump, I guess one of the things that I kind of said a while ago when he started to pick up uh, steam, along the way in the election here, is that once again I was upset that he wasn't discussing certain issues that I found to be, very relevant. Um, even though he has sort of said things like, talking about auditing the Federal Reserve is usually a topic that politicians don't discuss. I was a little bit happy about that, but I didn't think he went far enough in that discussion. I didn't think he was discussing Israel enough, and his foreign policy seemed pretty scary. So I wasn't really coming out in support of him at all. But one of the things I found interesting here was in these two articles that I have up top, he is sort of touching on certain things that I find, I guess I would say, a little bit more volatile than the topics that most candidates are discussing. And I kind of wanted to see more what you guys think about this. How real any of this is, or how much it doesn't really matter. But I'm not necessarily too sold by it, and I kind of wanted to see what the audience thought. But we can see Trump talking about the national debt and how it kind of compares to military spending, which kind of goes against some of his more militaristic rhetoric, I would have to say. And then later on, this is the part that I'm really getting at, is where he talks about, essentially saying that if NATO breaks up, it's not the end of the world, it's not a huge deal. Candidates on both sides, when it comes to the NATO topic, are generally going to agree. They want to keep funding NATO, they want to keep NATO going because it serves the agenda of everybody involved, whether it's other countries like Israel or, Saudi Arabia, anybody that we help in the Middle East, or just, in Europe, as far as Western Europe essentially not having to pay for their own defense and allowing the Western hegemony to continue. So, with Trump coming out saying that it wouldn't be the end of the world if that were to break up, that's a pretty volatile comment. Wanted to see what you guys thought about that. And of course, the New York Times, pretty commonly they're going to try to frame things, and I'll point this out, later on in the article, but they're going to try to frame things in the most negative way possible. But the exact same thing, they're using the same quote as Reuters talking about the NATO issue. Obviously, Ted Cruz, typical Republican, is completely supporting NATO, but this is one of those topics, again, I just want to point out. Let's look at the other side. On the left, of course, Hillary Clinton, being essentially a war hawk, is going to be supporting NATO. You can already see her making comments about this against Trump. And Bernie Sanders kind of doing the usual ducking on this topic. One of the things about Bernie Sanders is a lot of people don't discuss his foreign policy because he doesn't discuss his foreign policy very much. The last time a Democrat told us they were going to get out of war, that was, the current administration, and it didn't really happen. But, Bernie, I think, would be pretty much, right in that same vein. So you don't see him discussing it nearly as much, and that's sort of swept under the rug with a lot of his voters, especially, in the younger generations. So, moving on, one of the things that Trump was discussing was nuclear, the nuclear arsenal of the Asia Pacific region, and essentially saying that countries like Japan could take care of themselves if they had a nuclear arsenal, and then we wouldn't have to spend so much money to essentially provide their military for them so that they don't have one. Um, Kind of interesting, but at the same time, you see what I mean about how he might say something negative about NATO, but then he talks about increasing nuclear arsenals and having an aggressive foreign policy. And these are the reasons that, unlike some other people in the alt media, I'm not really sold by him at all. So I just want to see what you guys think about some of these conflicting, quotes of his or anything, or just if you have any thoughts on it in general. A couple things that I wanted to touch on along the way this morning are almost quick follow-ups on topics I've discussed. In the past, I've discussed, how the government currently, due to our wars in the Middle East, is increasing the heroin epidemic. And you can see here in the New York Times an article that I saw when I was pulling up that Trump article about crime spike in St. Louis traced to cheap heroin and Mexican cartels. It's pretty interesting that even though there's an element of truth to that, they will sort of divert your attention by using the whole Mexican cartel angle. This sort of diverts your attention purposely away from the idea that, the Middle East isn't in any way involved or that the U.S. war on terror is somehow to blame for any of this. What is actually happening is you have to go further back because the Mexican cartels, as far as their involvement, they're essentially more distributors. They're transporting and moving the drugs to where they need to get. What we need to be looking at is why is heroin being, increasingly able to be bought, and also why is it becoming so cheap and readily available? That is because of all of the cultivation happening in the Middle East, which has been allowed to happen because of our military. And this is a problem that we're just going to see continue and mount as the years go on. So you're going to see, spikes like this in other major cities. They already mentioned here Chicago, Baltimore, Milwaukee, Philadelphia. These issues that already have, evolved very, very deeply in these cities. And essentially, I just want to point out that they're really trying to divert your attention here by even mentioning the Mexican cartels, because the poppy that is being cultivated to make the heroin is essentially being all cultivated in the Middle East, well over 90%, and essentially under the guard of the American military. So these Mexican cartels wouldn't have the increased access to the drug if it weren't for all of the poppy crop being grown in the Middle East, and if it weren't for the fact that we essentially have allowed it to continue. So we have to go further down the line of why this issue is even happening, and we need to start addressing what's going on in the Middle East and not just Mexican drug cartels, which are sort of this ambiguous boogeyman that, the DEA likes to throw around as the end-all be-all in the drug world, when in reality, American intelligence is essentially controlling the actual source of the cartels, thereby essentially circumventing them as the controllers within that world. So we have to be aware of who's actually at the top, and we have to be not assuming that mid-level players like the Mexican cartels are actually at the top, because they're not. They're really the puppets, and we have to be looking at the puppet masters. So look into that topic more, guys, because it's far from over. So this isn't really the last time you'll probably see me report on it. Moving on, let's see. Yeah, this story I found pretty interesting, just to kind of point out the overall topic of government collusion with corporations. And I think this is something that I need to point out to more people, because I think it would help, I guess I would say, equalize the playing field of how they sort of view the political landscape in this country. Essentially, this article, which you can find currently on the Anti-Media, I would suggest anybody to go ahead and check it out, talks about how Google made a new platform and they were able to track Syrian military members who were trying to defect away from the Assad regime. And it kind of tries to come off like an innocent program that was just trying to do something kind of interesting and maybe good for the Syrian people. But in reality, this is an example of the American government using corporate power and technological achievements which they didn't come up with, but corporations have come up with, and in which they have usurped, and using it for the purpose of trying to effect change abroad. So what you need to see this as is essentially the government using a technological platform to effect propaganda, to try to find ways to get more people to defect away from Assad, to try to organize those who have already defected. I mean, here we have, a publicly traded American company working hand in glove with the American government to destabilize a region which our president, up until recently claimed that we didn't even have, any forces in or that we had nothing to do with. And, things like this need to sort of open people's eyes to what's really going on in Syria. And you need to be shown that it's not just, the military or the very high echelons of government, but actually our corporations that we often love, like Google, are working with them. And, look at the political leanings of these people, and they're not as heroic as you think they are. They're actually working with the government, regardless of what their aim is, regardless of what their party is. And that's how these companies, like Google, like Facebook, etc., get so big in the first place. A lot of their money comes from hedge funds and groups, investment firms set up by the CIA. They make sure that their technology essentially survives and develops so that they can then go ahead and use it. And this is a great example of a company being essentially used as a tool of war. And, I question, do the shareholders of Google know about this? Do they approve of it? If they do know of it, is this something that we should be discussing more? Um, you know, Regular tax dollars as well as investment dollars are being used for the purposes of destabilizing foreign governments, and apparently that's not even worth reporting in the regular media. So I wanted to see if anybody found that relevant out there, because I certainly do. And to finish up, guys, just to essentially recap on the whole phone thing, you've seen some other people, talking about this now, and essentially it seems kind of to be what I was saying in the last video I made, just a complete, smoke and mirrors operation going on between the government and Apple to sort of make people think that they don't have the ability to crack their phone, or that if they do, they have to go around Apple to do it because Apple is just such a heroic company and is fighting the government. And, apparently we're supposed to believe that this whole show is legitimate. And you can kind of see now that, number one, it's not. And that, number two, regardless of whether or not Apple is going to cooperate, your data is just as easily hacked now as it was before this whole thing took place. So once again, just a show. Doesn't make a difference. Nobody is in any different situation than they were before as far as the privacy of their electronics and their personal cell phones. But apparently now some people feel better about Apple, and it's a win-win situation for both the government and the propaganda of the Apple company. So I guess I just want to see, how anybody even still believes that this story is in any way legitimate, how it's not just a psychological operation to make people think that they're safe and that Apple is a legitimate company in some way. But that's pretty much what it seems like this has turned into, guys. So let me know if there's anything else you wanted me to discuss. I'm doing some research right now for, some more long-term projects. I've had some things that I wanted to look over in more detail, so I just wanted to talk about the topics that have been on my mind that I've been thinking about. So let me know what you think, and we'll talk soon.